References to the Terminator movies in the Resident Evil video games. Maybe you've seen a few, and maybe you've never noticed any. But there are lots of them. Lots that cover the themes, the characters, and the events that take place in the Terminator films also seem to come up in the Resident Evil series. This makes me think that the good people at Capcom must have been big fans of the Terminator and Terminator 2 Judgment Day. There are arguably a lot of different movies that have influenced the Resident Evil games, as after all, the original plan for the game was to be a game inspired by Capcom's earlier game, Sweet Home, which itself was based on a movie called Sweet Home. The influence of Sweet Home gave Resident Evil its spooky mansion setting, but beyond Sweet Home, you can also look primarily to the likes of the zombie movies like The Night of the Living Dead, or to the likes of things like The Fly or The Thing, or B-movie creature features like Tarantula or Jaws. I'm going to save discussion for some of these for another day, as although there are tons of potential movie influences on the Resident Evil series overall, the one that has always caught my attention most was the similarities between the Resident Evil games and the Terminator films. The first Terminator film came out in 1984, and the second in 1991. And whilst the first movie was science fiction blended with horror, the second one went decidedly more towards action, and edged ever so slightly more away from the horror elements. Likewise, the Resident Evil games have followed a similar path, where the first one was horror-focused, and the second one became more about the action. In today's discussion, I'll be looking at all of the nods and references, influences and homages that I can find in the Resident Evil games that link them to the Terminator films. Maybe some of them are coincidence, but there are so many that I think it's worth grabbing an Uzi and a mixed herb and that we go and check it out. Now, some of these references are big and some are just small moments, but I promise you, this is going to be a wild ride. So without further ado, we are about to enter the world of survival horror and say hasta la vista, Nemesis. So to start things off, let's look at a few of the smaller references before we get into the big meaty ones. In Terminator 2 Judgment Day, we get a scene where the T-800 has his glasses punched off his face. This is knocked off his face by a woman security guard at the mental asylum prison thing that Sarah Connor is being held at. The Terminator then turns back to look at her with a slow head turn. In Resident Evil Code Veronica, Chris Redfield punches Albert Wesker in the face and knocks his glasses off. In much the same way as Arnold Schwarzenegger did, Wesker then does the slow head turn.
Now die.
This is a double reference, in fact, as we see Wesker has red eyes, which is something long associated to the Terminator. When we see Wesker in this scene, his eyes are a little bit more alien looking than the Terminator's, but earlier in the game when he has his sunglasses on, we distinctly see that Wesker's eyes glow red, which is much the same as the marketing for the Terminator, where the T-800 has got his glasses on, but we can see a red glow from underneath. We also see Chris Redfield attack Wesker with a metal pipe. This, of course, is like when Kyle Reese attacks the T-800 with a metal pipe at the end of the Terminator. In both instances, the villain then immediately gets the upper hand. In Terminator 2 Judgment Day, the T-1000 is finally defeated by being shot repeatedly until he falls into a vat of molten steel. In Resident Evil 2, one of the two main antagonists is Mr. X, who is seemingly defeated in the same way and falls into a vat of molten metal. Albert Wesker then dies in Resident Evil 5 by falling into molten lava in a volcano. Epic death. But before he dies, he is shown to be struggling and thrashing about in much the same way as the T-1000 is shown to struggle and thrash about in Terminator 2 whilst in the molten metal. The general look of Albert Wesker is also somewhat similar to the T-1000, with a similar slim build and bad guy haircut, and also something of a police uniform. Wesker was of course based on the live action actor who played him in Resident Evil 1, but I can believe he was cast because of this similar look and vibe. Looking at Leon S. Kennedy from Resident Evil 2, he does kind of look like a grown-up John Connor from Terminator 2. Now, Edward Furlong, who played John in Terminator 2, may not resemble Leon now that he is an adult, but I'd say he resembled him when he was about 19 or early 20s, as Leon was meant to be in Resident Evil 2. Okay, so they are a few of the smaller references that I found, but now let's look some of the bigger ones, and the most obvious comparison between the two franchises is that of the Terminator to the Tyrants. As you'll see throughout this exploration, throughout the Resident Evil series, they've taken a lot of inspiration from the Terminators being an unstoppable stalker character. Many games have unstoppable stalkers, and I can look back to the likes of Berserk on the Atari, or the Friday the 13th or Dead by Daylight games where you have an unkillable enemy that you just have to run away from. But I think everyone will agree that even if other games have this element, nothing embraced it as much as the Resident Evil franchise has with their characters Mr. X and Nemesis in Resident Evils 2 and 3 and their remakes, and later with Jack Baker and Lady Dimitrescu in Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil Village respectively. When we first meet the Tyrant in Resident Evil 1, we see that he is in a glass tube and both completely naked and dormant. This is because, like a lot of monsters in the Resident Evil games, we see them in glass tubes to give the idea that they are manufactured. In the Terminator series, starting with a specifically shot trailer for Terminator 2, it shows that the T-800 Terminators, as played by Arnold Schwarzenegger, are also produced on a production line. Both the T-800 and the Tyrant are shown to have hulking physical builds, and although there are differences in how they are introduced to audiences, there are more similarities. The T-800 is shown both in Terminator 1 and Terminator 2 to arrive from the future into the present day completely naked. Now, I'm having to be careful with any usage of footage in this video as it is, as I don't think I'll be able to show naked Arnold, even if it is for educational purposes here on YouTube, but I'll instead show his arrival in Terminator 2 as portrayed in the Sega Mega Drive game. Now, as you can see, the naked Terminator model T-101 arrives positioned on one knee and slowly rises to a standing position and then calmly walks towards his targets. Instead of arriving in electricity, the Tyrant T-001 escapes the glass tube and then lands with one knee forward and slowly rises before walking to its target. Now, let's look at the name of the Terminators that are in the franchise. The Terminators all have names like T-800, T-1000, TX, and model numbers like T-101. Now, for some reason, it's like Skynet went with a naming system similar to Atari, with a 2600 and 5200, and home computers like the 800 and 400, also like Commodore did with the Amiga line of computers. Now, I get it, this is a film made in the 1980s, and so back those days it was very cool just to add something 100 to the end of what you're naming. Now, the Resident Evil games followed suit with this naming system for their Tyrants, Because in the Resident Evil games we have tyrants that are named T001, T002 and Mr. X. So from the Arnie Terminator, which is traditionally shown as a T800 or model T101, there is the first tyrant T001 that upgrades to T102, and then of course there is the T103 known as Mr. X. Although it is worth noting that this tyrant was from Resident Evil 2, which predated the release of Terminator 3 Rise of the Machines, where we would be introduced to the Terminator TX. But it's no surprise that this naming pattern would continue over at the Terminator films, as whilst the 80s and 90s were all about the numbers 500, 1000, and especially 2000, by the late 90s and early noughties, the cool thing to name things after was with the letter X. Like you got D-Generation X in wrestling, Xbox in gaming, and Extreme Improv. And let's look at the purpose of both the Terminators and the Tyrants. In the Terminator films, we have these killer robots who are sent back in time as hunters. And yes, there are Resident Evil monsters called hunters. And these Terminators have specific targets they are going after. In the first film, the T-800 is after Sarah Connor, and in the following film, they're after their real target, which is her son, John Connor. Meanwhile, in the second Resident Evil game, the Tyrant T-103, aka Mr. X, is continually after the carrier of the G-Virus sample. This is either Ada Wong or Sherry Birkin. So, like in the Terminator films, the Terminator and Mr. X are either after an adult female or a small child. Unlike Sarah Connor in the first Terminator film, who is something of a damsel in distress, Ada Wong is more capable and a fighter, like how Sarah becomes in Terminator 2. Undoubtedly though, the bigger comparison is that the Terminator and Mr. X both pursue a small child who needs a protector to help them escape and also defeat their would-be assailant. There are several games that introduced a Terminator-like final boss, with both Rise of the Robots and Body Blows being two examples of such games that I have previously featured on this channel. I'd say it was the Resident Evil games though that really looked to develop this further. After the Tyrant would chase you around single areas in the first game, Mr. X would be the evolution of this idea and would be a continuous presence throughout the game, continually pursuing you through several areas. Whereas all of the enemies in the first game were shown to be somewhat mindless and driven by their instinct to eat flesh, and only a couple being shown as even intelligent enough to open doors, Mr. X is the first of Umbrella's bioweapons, which can be given a specific mission. In this case, he is pursuing Sherry Birkin or Ada Wong as the people that carry the sample of the G-Virus. Now, I'll be honest, I'm not entirely sure how any biological weapons in the Resident Evil games are programmed or controlled. From what I was able to look up, they may have some kind of electronic device implanted into them to control them, but giving them a specific mission is very much like the Terminators. By the time Capcom made Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, they developed this concept even more, with the titular character Nemesis being a foe that was able to chase you from room to room, and if you went into a different room and then back again, he would chase you from one room to the next. This wasn't just like the set pieces in Resident Evil 2 anymore. The Nemesis also famously says the word stars to reflect his mission is to hunt after the members of the Special Tactics and Rescue Service police unit that the main character of the game, Jill Valentine, is part of. Now, this may be slightly cheating as it comes from the second live-action Resident Evil movie rather than one of the games, but in Resident Evil Apocalypse, the Nemesis monster is shown to have a heads-up display within his vision, and this makes him even more Terminator-like. It's covered with zeros and ones and lists his targets and info about his ammo and risk factors of threat. And all of this is the kind of stuff you'd see on the heads-up display of the Terminator. The biggest thing though is that the Nemesis's vision is shown to be covered in a blue filter, much like how the Terminator's has a red filter. But speaking of that red filter, the Red Queen in the game Resident Evil The Umbrella Chronicles is also shown to see things through a red filter, just like the Terminator. Now, if you weren't convinced that Nemesis in Resident Evil 3 is an even more blatant take on the Terminator than Mr. X was in Resident Evil 2, then perhaps Jill Valentine basically being Sarah Connor in the game may convince you. The second Terminator film starts with opening narration from Sarah Connor, and this theme is continued with Jill Valentine giving opening narration during the start of Resident Evil 3. The general tone of the information they give and the music underscoring the scene also has a similar vibe. Let's take a listen to see how the two compare.
The first Terminator was programmed to strike at me in the year 1984. Before John was born. It failed. The second was set to strike at John himself when he was still a child. As before, the Resistance was able to send a lone warrior, a protector for John. It was just a question of which one of them would reach him first.
Yes, that's right, I did just trick you, or at least I tried to, because I was a little bit crafty here, because YouTube wouldn't like me playing the theme from the Terminator, and I'm having to be really careful with showing any archival footage or using audio from the Terminator films, because YouTube just doesn't like that kind of thing. Instead, what you heard was the opening narration from Terminator 2 overlaid over the music of the opening narration of Resident Evil 3, but see how perfectly it fits. Now let's hear what you just got in Resident Evil 3.
It all began as an ordinary day in September, an ordinary day in Raccoon City, a city controlled by Umbrella. No one dared to oppose them, and that lack of strength would ultimately lead to their destruction. I suppose they had to suffer the consequences of their actions, but there would be no forgiveness. If only they had had the courage to fight. It's true that once the wheels of justice begin to turn, nothing can stop them. Nothing. It was Raccoon City's last chance, and my last chance. My last escape.
See? Pretty much the same tone. And also, her last chance, her last escape, you could say it was her Judgment Day. And add to this that in Resident Evil Remake, Jill has an extra costume, where she is wearing a tank top and a black baseball cap, much like Sarah Connor is in Terminator 2. This look for Jill is of course continued within Resident Evil 5 with Jill's BSAA look. Now, coming back to Umbrella, they are to Resident Evil games what Skynet is to the Terminator franchise. And yes, look, when I say Skynet, of course I do mean Cyberdyne systems, but it's just more people will know what I mean by Skynet. Both the Terminator and Resident Evil universes feature apocalyptic near-world ending crises that are the result of government-controlled and contracted evil corporations. In the Terminator franchise, it's the company Cyberdyne Systems who developed the Skynet artificial intelligence for military purposes that almost wipes out the human human race. And in Resident Evil, it's the Umbrella Corporation who create biological weapons known as the T-Virus or G-Virus. Next up, let's talk about the original plan for Resident Evil 1. Shinji Mikami, who was the game developer who famously was tasked with creating this horror game for Capcom because he didn't like to be scared, had an early idea for the plot, which is very different to the game that was released as Resident Evil. Mikami's original idea for the game would feature humans who were cybernetically enhanced. Now, there was a character who would eventually be renamed to Barry Burton as he appears in the final game, and he was called Gelzer, and he was an Arnold Schwarzenegger looking dude who had lost an eye and had it replaced with an infrared scope. So yeah, an Arnie looking dude with one robotic eye is instantly very, very Terminator-like. The original plan of Resident Evil had of course been inspired by Capcom's earlier NES game Sweet Home, which of course was based off the movie of the same name. So if Mikami's original vision had come to pass, we'd have had a paranormal based enemy game instead of the zombies, and the game would basically become Ghosts versus Terminator. Of course, as history would tell us, the character Gelzer was scrapped and no characters were cybernetically enhanced with infrared scopes. But this change didn't stop Arnold Schwarzenegger's turn as the T-800 playing a major inspiration for the Tyrant in Resident Evil, as we discussed earlier. Interestingly, many years later there was the CGI Resident Evil film Resident Evil Vendetta, and this featured the characters Maria and Diego Gomez, both of which were injured, with Maria losing her eye and Diego being so injured that he needed to be cybernetically enhanced. And when you look at the character, he does kind of look like the original plan for Gelzer. So maybe this idea was brought up later. Now obviously, it being many years removed from when Shinji Mikami originally came up with the idea for Gelzer, you could say that perhaps it's just coincidence. But this wasn't a million miles from when they released the remake of Resident Evil 2, which did give Claire Redfield an Elsa Walker costume in reference to the scrapped version of her original character. Resident Evil 4 introduces us to the villain Verdugo. Verdugo is the Spanish word for executioner, and yes, executioner is basically a synonym for Terminator. The comparisons to Terminators continue as, like the Terminators, Verdugo is shown disguised as a human, but like the Terminator is later revealed to be a scary monster underneath the initial human-like appearance. Also, like a Terminator, Verdugo has red glowing eyes, and the upper half of his head isn't unlike the robot skeleton inside the T-800. And like the T-800 is another Resident Evil villain that sees things through a red filter. Also, like the T-1000, he can attack you with stabbing a sharp spear-like appendage through the ceiling. In the Terminator, Reese says the famous line, "Come with me if you want to live." This is perhaps the most iconic Terminator quote after "I'll be back," and is repeated several times throughout the series. This is also famously the first thing that Reese says to Sarah Connor when they meet. And like this, in Resident Evil The Umbrella Chronicles, when the section based on Resident Evil 3 occurs, we see Carlos save Jill and then say to her, "Come with me." It just needed that "if you want to live" line to be perfect. Add to this that Leon and the T-800 both offer their hand in the same way in the second game, and another similar moment comes in Resident Evil 2 when Leon first meets Claire Redfield. Just like when the T-800 first meets John Connor in Terminator 2 and tells John, "Get down." When Leon first meets Claire, his first words to her are "Get down" as well. Now, speaking of introducing introductions. The first time we meet both Claire Redfield in Resident Evil 2 and Sarah Connor in The Terminator, they are introduced riding a motorcycle. Back to Code Veronica when defeating the final boss, Alexia. The face of Alexia becomes distorted as she realizes that she is defeated. This looks similar to the T-1000's face as it melts in Terminator 2 when he knows that he is defeated and melting in the molten metal. In Resident Evil 5, there is a death sequence that is possible where Albert Wesker can punch through Chris's gut to kill him, much like Arnold Schwarzenegger punches through the gut of one of the punks he first meets in the original Terminator. In Resident Evil 2, there is a scene where Leon and Ada are on a cable car and William Birkin stabs his sharp claws through the top of the train. This is very reminiscent to when the T-1000 stabs his pointy spear-like arms through the top of the elevator in Terminator 2. In both the film and the game, the characters can shoot up to the enemy, but in both cases, it's best just to dodge. Back to Resident Evil Code Veronica, and we see Albert Wesker emerge from wreckage just as the Terminator does at the end of The Terminator. This continues the theme that Wesker is heavily based on the Terminator for his inspiration. A big theme of the Terminator films is that in the future, the human race are almost completely wiped out by Skynet unleashing nuclear bombs across the world. Sarah has nightmares about the nuclear bombs going off in Terminator 2, and the music and sound that accompanies it really does add to the effect of how devastating this all is. The end of Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, of course, sees Raccoon City wiped off the map by a nuclear bomb, and it is much the same way that Sarah dreams about the bomb going off in Terminator 2. The soundtrack is even also similar. Back to Resident Evil 4, and here's something I missed earlier when speaking about our good friend Verdugo. Just like the T-1000 gets frozen with liquid nitrogen in Terminator 2, you can knock over canisters and freeze Verdugo in Resident Evil 4. And just like the T-800 shoots the frozen T-1000 and shatters him, if you grab your rocket launcher and shoot the frozen Verdugo, you too can shatter him and watch him explode into hundreds of pieces in Resident Evil 4. Perhaps my favourite Resident Evil to Terminator reference comes in Resident Evil 5. Now, this is a blink and you'll miss it reference, but it is so cool. When fighting Albert Wesker, he will sometimes stop and wag his finger to say, no, naughty, naughty, just as the T-1000 does at the end of Terminator 2. The fact that Wesker looks like the T-1000 and does the same villainous mocking with the finger is a brilliant little Easter egg. But now I'll just wait for everyone to tell me this was actually a reference to the chunk-looking guy from Goonies in Jurassic Park. In Resident Evil 4, Leon says "Hasta luego" to Mendez before setting him on fire, which is similar to Arnold saying "Hasta la vista, baby" to the T-1000 in Terminator 2.
Hasta luego.
I think it's worth pointing out that both the Resident Evil and Terminator franchises are decades old now, and as such, there have been many people taking over the reins to be in charge of both franchises. The first Resident Evil game came out in 1996, so at the time of writing this, it's just under 30 years old. Meanwhile, the first Terminator film came out in 1984, which means it's 40 years old at the time of this exploration. I mention this because the influence of the Terminator films is most evident in the early years of the Resident Evil franchise, but as I have found connections between the two of them, from the first Resident Evil game released in 1996 up until about Resident Evil 5 that released in about 2010. As the Resident Evil games have been remade with the remakes of 1, 2, 3 and 4, some of these have in turn also featured connections to the Terminator films, but it's primarily because these are recreating what was in the earlier original Resident Evil games rather than it being done as an intended specific Terminator reference. And so there you have it, all the references to the Terminator films that I could spot in the Resident Evil games. Was this all intentional on Capcom's part, or are some of these just coincidence, or a case of when you look for similarities or parallels, you are always likely to find some? For me, I think I'm right in saying that most of these were intentionally similar, as they were clearly Terminator fans who took inspiration from it. But I'm also the same guy who made a video pointing out how Capcom had made Resident Evil 4 as a partial remake of Final Fight 1. You can check out my video on that, which is also on this channel. The Resident Evil games certainly did take a lot of inspiration from the first two Terminator films, but these weren't the only films to inspire the Resident Evil games. I'll be back another day with another video to explore what other movies have inspired the Resident Evil / Biohazard franchise, and I'll also be back to demonstrate how another unexpected game could be seen as the inspiration for Resident Evil 4. But I also wanted to thank everyone that has come to this channel, as we've now reached over 1,000 subscribers, and I want to thank you for that support. I look forward to bringing you lots more reviews, deep dives and documentaries, and especially stuff based on more survival horrors. So do look out for that in the coming weeks and months. And if you haven't done so already, I would really appreciate if you would smash that subscribe button here on the Geek Battle Gaming YouTube channel, as there will be a lot more exciting content that I've got planned for you, which is already in production. So with that, until next time, smash that subscribe button here on the Geek Battle Gaming YouTube channel. Do check out www.xstreamed.tv/gaming for the written article version of any of my videos. And until next time, stay safe, always stay extremed, and ciao for now. Boom, and we're off the air.